I'm Dr. Carl Schreck. In this video, I'll be giving some of the historical context for Hurricane Helene, in particular comparing it to some of the other historical flooding events in western North Carolina, like the major floods of 1916 and 2004, both of which were caused by pairs of tropical storms passing through our region. I'll also be showing how it wasn't just a historical event for our region, but it was actually one of the most significant hurricanes in U.S. history as well. And a big part of that was associated with all the inland rainfall that caused all that flooding and landslides. And that's something that just simply doesn't get enough attention with hurricanes. First, here I'm showing all the tracks of hurricanes that pass within about 60 miles or so of Asheville. And you'll see there's kind of two main pathways that these storms tend to take. Either they form out over the Atlantic and kind of come up through South Carolina and the Piedmont on their way here. That's what happened with Hurricane Hugo back in 1989. Or they form down in the Western Caribbean and come up through the Gulf and pass through Alabama or Georgia on their way here. And that's what happened with Hurricane Helene. Now, one of the other things you might notice are that most of those tracks tend to be blue or green by the time they make it up here to western North Carolina. They're tropical storms or tropical depressions at that point, much weaker than they had been when they were out over the ocean. I don't have the intensity here for Hurricane Helene, but if I did, it would show that it made landfall in Florida as a Category 4 storm, and then maintained itself as a hurricane all the way up through the middle of Georgia, and then was still a strong tropical storm as it was passing through our region. However, Hurricane Helene was one of the largest storms on record and also one of the fastest moving for the northern Gulf. And so because of that, it was able to bring its swath of heavy winds much farther inland than most storms might. Before Hurricane Helene, the most recent major flooding event in our region was Tropical Storm Fred in 2021. And where Helene was this huge, big event that dropped heavy rainfall all around the southern Appalachia, Tropical Storm Fred was a lot smaller and more localized. It caused about 20 inches of rain, but in a small part of Transylvania County, southwest of Asheville. Even so, it was really devastating, especially for the town of Canton, North Carolina, where the flooding caused over $1 billion worth of damage. Now, before Helene, if you talk to folks in our area, the event that they most likely would have either remembered or at least heard about were Hurricanes Francis and Ivan back in 2004. And in 2004, these two storms both passed through our region about a week or two apart, each dropping over a foot worth of rain on the area. And so when Hurricane Francis came through, dropped a foot of rain, and then when Ivan finally came through, the rivers were already still high. And so you drop another foot of rain on top of that, and it caused significant flooding like shown here in Biltmore Village in downtown Asheville. And so kind of the folklore in our region was that our rivers can generally handle one hurricane. But when you have two hurricanes back to back, that's when you start getting this severe flooding. And some of that folklore dates back to 1916, which was the flood of record for our region, at least up until Hurricane Helene. And similar to 2004, this was two hurricanes that passed through our region. In this case, they were actually in July, which is a little unusual. Typically, we get our storms in September or October. But they can happen earlier in the summer as well. And similar to 2004, each of these storms dropped actually like 18 to 20 inches of rain, maybe even 30 in some places. And again, it was that combined effect of both storms that really caused incredible flooding, like the picture here showing the French Broad River going all the way up to some of the railroad trestles and the eaves of some of the houses. And many of us in the region thought that pictures like this just simply weren't possible with modern flood control. But unfortunately, this picture looks all too familiar to a lot of the sites we saw during Hurricane Helene. Here I'm showing the rainfall totals from CoCoRaHS observers like myself, volunteer observers that check their rain gauge every morning at 7 a.m. and report it to the National Weather Service. At my house, we got 10 inches of rain, that big 10 in the middle of the map. But lots of folks kind of east of us along the Blue Ridge Escarpment got 20 to 30 inches of rain. And again, this happened from just one storm, where most of the other past flooding events happened from two storms. except that this really was kind of two storms as well. In addition to the hurricane itself, we had this predecessor rainfall event, where there's this cold front that would have caused it to rain anyway for 2 days. However, because there was a hurricane down in the Gulf, it was funneling all this moisture up the coast. And when that moisture ran into the frontal zone and ran into the mountains, it wrung all that moisture out and caused a lot of the initial rainfall. At my house, we got more than half the rain came from the predecessor rainfall event before the hurricane ever got here. So this was really a compound disaster similar to the other ones that we talked about, except in this case we had a predecessor rainfall event followed by the hurricane itself. Now I knew this was a historical event for Western North Carolina, but it wasn't until later that I started to realize it was actually a significant event in U.S. history as well. Here are the top 10 most costly storms in U.S. history since 1980. The most damaging storm is still Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where there was all the damage in Biloxi, but also the flooding in New Orleans associated with the levee failures, so it caused over $200 billion worth of damage. Hurricane Helene comes in at number 7 on this list, with about $79 billion worth of damage in total, but $59 billion of that was just right here in North Carolina. So even the North Carolina component by itself would have fallen on this top 10 list right about in line with Hurricane Andrew in 1992 down in Miami. Even more tragic was that the Hurricane Helene makes this list of the top 10 deadliest storms since 1950. Now, as we go down this list, you start with Hurricane Maria in 2017 that caused almost 3,000 deaths in Puerto Rico. A major hurricane hitting a small island, that makes sense that a lot of people would sadly die from a storm like that. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, we know that over 1,000 people died in association with the levee failures in New Orleans and the subsequent flooding. Then you go back to some more historical storms in Gulf Coast, Audrey in 1957 and Camille in 1969, which was Katrina before there was Katrina. And then next on the list was Hurricane Helene. Even here in North Carolina, over 100 people died, and even that would have made this top 10 list as well. Now, a big part of why so many people died during Hurricane Helene was the inland flooding, the inland rainfall. So the National Hurricane Center tracks the direct causes of deaths associated with hurricanes, and for the past 10 years or so, over half the deaths are associated with inland rain, just like we saw during Hurricane Helene. This may be surprising because typically when a storm is approaching the U.S., most of the media attention is on the winds and the risk of the storm surge. And those are very dangerous and very deadly, but they're primarily a problem within a few miles of the coastline. The rainfall, that can go hundreds or even thousands of miles inland, as we tragically saw with Hurricane Helene. Another thing that was surprising to me with Hurricane Helene was that 65 people died in association with the wind damage from the hurricane, and that was the most from any hurricane since 1964. Now, to me, thinking about like Hurricane Andrew in 1992, that was a Category 5 hurricane making landfall near Miami, I would have thought more people would have died from the wind there. But I think what happened with Hurricane Helene was that because it was a larger storm and moving more rapidly, its swath of winds made it much farther inland than a lot of these other hurricanes. And so there were a lot of deaths, for example, in Georgia associated with the winds from this storm. So in this video, we talked about the historical context for Hurricane Helene. We talked about some of the major flooding events, specifically in 1916 and 2004 in Western North Carolina history, both of which were caused by pairs of tropical storms. Helene was just a single storm, but it also kind of wasn't because we had this predecessor rainfall event. And Hurricane Helene wasn't just a major event for our region, it was actually one of the most significant storms in U.S. history as well. And a big part of that was because of inland flooding is such a dangerous threat from hurricanes. And so often with hurricanes, we talk about the wind and storm surge as the storm is approaching. But usually after the storm has actually gone through, most of the headlines are probably going to be about all the flooding that was caused by the rainfall, just like we saw with Hurricane Helene.